June 6, 1944, 07:45 hours. Off the coast of Courseulles-sur-Mer, Normandy, cold channel spray whips across the steel ramp of Landing Craft Assault 137 as it heaves violently in the gray swells. Nausea and the acrid stench of diesel exhaust cling to the men of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Water crashes over the gunnels, soaking the heavy wool uniforms of the assault troops. Up front, a young Bren gunner grips the cold steel of his weapon, his knuckles white, staring at the rapidly approaching shoreline obscured by churning black smoke and geysers of displaced seawater. Suddenly, the flat crack of German 88mm shells overhead is drowned out by the deafening, metallic shriek of the craft grinding onto the submerged obstacles of the Atlantic Wall. The ramp drops. A scythe of MG-42 machine gun fire rips into the opening. The invasion has begun. To understand the measure of a soldier, you must witness him not in the parade square, but in the meat grinder of an opposed amphibious assault. For the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, June 6th was a crucible of fire, sand, and blood. Their objective was Juno Beach, a 5-mile stretch of the Normandy coastline flanked by the British at Gold and Sword beaches. The German defenders, deeply entrenched in concrete Widerstandsnests, resistance nests, heavily fortified with interlocking fields of fire, expected to slaughter the invaders at the water's edge. Field Marshal Rommel, the architect of this Atlantic Wall, had staked everything on this defensive doctrine. The invasion must be stopped on the beaches, or the war in the West would be lost. But on the morning of June 6th, Rommel was not in Normandy. 400 miles away in Herlingen, Germany, the Desert Fox was celebrating his wife Lucy's birthday, having been assured by meteorologists that the atrocious weather in the English Channel made an Allied landing impossible. Back at Army Group B headquarters in the chalk cliffs of La Roche-Guyon, his chief of staff, General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, was frantically trying to pierce the fog of war. The telephone lines crackled with disjointed, panicked reports from the coast, paratroopers dropping in the dark, massive naval bombardments, and now, at dawn, thousands of landing craft materializing from the mist. At Juno Beach, the Canadian assault was staggering under brutal casualties. The naval bombardment had largely missed the frontline German bunkers, leaving the coastal defense troops of the 716th Infantry Division virtually untouched and fully alert. The Queen's Own Rifles, storming the sector codenamed Nan, lost half their men in the leading companies within the first few minutes. Bodies choked the tide line, rolling in the crimson surf alongside shattered Higgins boats and burning duplex-drive Sherman tanks that had swamped in the rough seas. Yet, amidst the slaughter, a profound and terrifying momentum began to build, a momentum that would soon draw the obsessive attention of Rommel himself. The Canadians did not break. Driven by a desperate, ferocious resolve, sections of infantry clawed their way across the open sand. Armed with Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I rifles and Sten submachine guns, they initiated ruthless, close-quarters clearance of the German trench systems. Combat engineers, under heavy fire, deployed Churchill AVREs, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, to blow massive holes in the concrete seawalls using 290mm petard mortars, affectionately known as flying dustbins. By 0930 hours, the crust of the Atlantic Wall at Juno was shattered. The Royal Regina Rifles fought a savage house-to-house battle through the coastal town of Courseulles, using PIAT anti-tank projectors to blast German strongpoints hidden in cafes and cellars. The North Shore Regiment, backed by the rumbling armor of the Fort Garry Horse, bypassed pockets of resistance, pushing relentlessly inland. This was the Canadian tactical hallmark that would soon infuriate and impress the German High Command. An aggressive, almost reckless drive forward. While other Allied units consolidated their beachheads, the Canadians punched deep into the Norman countryside, their vanguard columns racing down narrow bocage lanes toward their D-Day objective, the vital Carpiquet Airfield in the city of Caen. By early afternoon, The situation map at La Roche-Guyon was a terrifying sight for the German staff officers. The red arrows denoting Allied advances were thickest and deepest in the Canadian sector. The 3rd Canadian Division had penetrated further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day, driving a massive wedge between the German 716th and 352nd Infantry Divisions. Rommel received the phone call from Speidel in the late morning. The shock was immediate. The Atlantic Wall, his impregnable fortress, had been breached in hours. Slamming down the receiver, Rommel ordered his driver to prepare his Hork staff car. The long, agonizing drive back to France began. As the tires chewed up the asphalt, Rommel's brilliant tactical mind raced. If the Allies linked their beachheads and pushed their armor inland, the static infantry divisions would be annihilated. He needed his panzers. He needed to hurl the invaders back into the sea before they could consolidate. But Hitler, sleeping late at the Berghof, had tightly controlled the strategic reserve. The formidable Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend were frozen in place, waiting for the Führer's personal release. Valuable hours bled away. When the release finally came late in the afternoon, it was the 12th SS Panzer, a division of fanatical, highly trained teenagers commanded by hardened Eastern Front veterans, that was ordered to smash the Canadian bridgehead. Commanded by SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, with the legendary and ruthless Kurt Panzermeier Meyer leading the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, they rumbled toward the sound of the guns. Meyer, riding in the cupola of his command tank, surveyed the chaotic battlefield as evening fell. He expected to find a timid enemy clinging to the safety of the naval guns. Instead, he found the Canadian vanguard, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, already digging in miles inland, dangerously close to the vital Carpiquet Airfield. The Canadians had not only cracked the wall, they had shattered the door off its hinges and were standing in the hallway. The stage was set for a brutal, grinding collision. Rommel, racing toward the front, still believed the situation could be salvaged with a concentrated armored thrust. He viewed the British and Commonwealth troops as methodical, perhaps overly cautious, relying entirely on their massive material superiority. But as the sun set on June 6th, the dust settling over the knocked-out armor and the freshly dug trenches around the villages of Ote and Buron, the German command was about to learn a bloody lesson. Over the next agonizing weeks, the fields of Normandy would become an abattoir. In the dense hedgerows and golden wheat fields, the fanatical zeal of the Hitlerjugend would clash with the grim, unyielding ferocity of the Canadians. It was here, amidst the shattered ruins of Norman villages and the deafening roar of artillery barrages, that the Canadian soldier would forge a reputation of terrifying lethality. As Rommel reviewed the casualty reports and operational maps in the days to come, the confident sneer of the German High Command would fade into a grim realization. The men from the prairies, the logging camps, and the cities of Canada were not merely holding the line. They were aggressively bleeding the absolute best units the Wehrmacht had to offer. The Desert Fox was about to encounter an enemy that defied his expectations, an adversary whose tenacity and ruthlessness in the close quarters hell of the bocage would force him to utter an assessment born of profound, grudging respect. The battle for the beach was over. The battle for Normandy and the true test of the Canadian military machine was just beginning. June 7th, 1944. 1400 hours. The village of Authie, 3 miles northwest of the city of Caen. A heavy, humid silence hangs over the waist-high fields of summer wheat. Private James McNeil of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders presses his face into the rich, dark Norman soil, the pungent scent of crushed stalks filling his nostrils. The deafening roar of D-Day has been replaced by an eerie, terrifying quiet. Ahead, the rutted dirt road dips toward the medieval stone spire of the Ardenne Abbey. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by the guttural, metallic shriek of Maybach HL230 V12 engines roaring to life. A flock of crows scatters frantically into the gray sky. From the dense tree line, the massive, sloped silhouettes of Panzerkampfwagen 4s and terrifying Panther tanks emerge, their long 75mm cannons tracking downward toward the Canadian lines. McNeil grips the scarred wood of his Lee Enfield rifle, his knuckles white. The earth begins to vibrate against his chest. The counterattack has arrived. High in the Gothic stone towers of the Ardenne Abbey, SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer had spent the morning watching the Canadians advance. His 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, backed by the heavy armor of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment under Max Vincha, lay in ambush, perfectly concealed within the ancient stone walls and dense, impenetrable hedgerows. Meyer, a ruthless and decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, watched with predatory patience as the vanguard of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the North Novas, and the Sherman tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers pushed dangerously deep into the German lines, extending their neck into his meticulously laid snare. Meyer's assessment was cold and calculating. Let them come closer, sever their supply lines, and annihilate them in the open. He firmly believed these untested Commonwealth troops would shatter in panic at the first shock of a concentrated SS armored assault. When Meyer finally issued the command to fire, the eruption of violence was apocalyptic. The concealed German armor opened up from point-blank range. Within minutes, a dozen Canadian Sherman tanks were reduced to burning, blackened pyres, their internal ammunition cooking off in catastrophic explosions that sent heavy steel turrets spinning 50 feet into the air. The hypervelocity, armor-piercing rounds of the German KWK-42 guns sliced through the thin steel of the Shermans as if they were made of tin. Deprived of their armored support, the Canadian infantry in the open wheat fields surrounding Authie and Buren were subjected to a merciless, intersecting crossfire from hidden MG-42 machine guns. The terrifying ripsaw sound of Hitler's buzzsaw cut down the Highlanders in sweeping swaths, turning the golden wheat red. Yet the predicted psychological collapse did not occur. Instead of breaking, routing, and running for the beaches, the surviving Canadians went to ground and fought back with a ferocity that stunned the fanatical Hitlerjugend. Sections of North Novas, entirely cut off and surrounded by enemy armor, refused to surrender. They fought until their ammunition pouches were empty, engaging in brutal, desperate hand-to-hand combat with trench knives, bayonets, and entrenching tools. In the smoldering, dust-choked ruins of Authie, anti-tank sections frantically maneuvered their unwieldy PIATs, projector, infantry, anti-tank, sprinting through enemy fire to score desperate point-blank hits on the tracks and vulnerable rear flanks of the advancing panzers. The Canadian resistance was chaotic and disjointed, but incredibly lethal. The grand German advance, designed to sweep the Allied invaders back into the English Channel, bogged down almost immediately in a bloody, close-quarters street brawl. But it was the events in the immediate aftermath of this engagement that would permanently alter the psychological landscape of the Normandy campaign, transforming a standard military objective into a bitter, unyielding blood feud. As the surviving North Novas and Sherbrooke Fusiliers were finally overwhelmed by sheer numbers and forced to surrender, they were disarmed and marched back to the Ardenne Abbey, Meyer's makeshift headquarters. Here, the deeply ingrained ideological fanaticism of the 12th SS revealed its darkest nature. Driven by the brutalizing, merciless ethos of the Russian front, and enraged by the surprisingly heavy casualties inflicted by the stubbornly resisting Canadians, the young SS troops committed unspeakable atrocities. Over the next 2 days, dozens of Canadian prisoners of war were systematically marched into the Abbey's quiet courtyards and execution grounds. They were forced to remove their tin helmets and were summarily shot in the back of the head. In total, over 156 Canadian POWs would be murdered by the 12th SS in the opening weeks of the campaign, at the Abbey, at the Château d'Audrieu, and at a dusty crossroads near the village of Le Mesnil-Patry. Word of the massacres spread rapidly through the ranks of the 3rd Canadian Division. When advancing Canadian units later discovered the shallow graves and the executed bodies of their comrades, a profound and terrifying shift occurred. The men from Halifax, Winnipeg, and Regina had landed in France as a professional, disciplined army fighting a conventional war for the liberation of Europe. The atrocities at the Ardenne Abbey transformed them. The war ceased to be merely tactical. It became deeply personal. An unspoken but universally understood doctrine permeated the Canadian lines. From this moment forward, the SS would be granted no quarter. This grim hardening of the Canadian fighting spirit manifested violently on the night of June 8th during the harrowing defense of Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse. The Royal Regina Rifles, dug deeply into the thick stone farmhouses of the village, found themselves directly in the path of another massive armored thrust by the 12th SS. Under the pitch-black cover of darkness, Kurt Meyer unleashed a column of Panther tanks straight down the main arterial road, expecting the sheer, vibrating terror of a nighttime armored assault to break the infantry's nerve. He was dead wrong. The Regina Rifles held their fire with iron discipline as the massive steel beasts clanked into the village square, their exhausts spitting blue flame. Then, from the pitch-black shadows of upper-story windows and ruined cellars, the Canadians unleashed hell. Piat gunners waited until the Panthers were mere yards away before firing their heavy, spring-loaded shaped charges into the thin top and rear armor of the tanks. Sherman Fireflies, armed with the devastating 17-pounder gun, fired from concealed, hull-down positions, their blinding muzzle flashes illuminating the chaotic, apocalyptic scene. Burning Panthers blocked the narrow road, trapping the trailing German armor in a deadly kill zone. Canadian infantry swarmed the stalled tanks, tossing Mills bombs into open commander hatches and engaging the dismounting Panzer Grenadiers in savage, point-blank street fighting. By dawn, the elite armored spearhead of the 12th SS lay shattered and burning in the streets of Bretteville. The Canadians had held the hinge. 50 miles away, deep inside the chalk cliff bunkers of Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stared at the massive wall maps with mounting apprehension. He had finally arrived from Germany, immediately throwing himself into the frantic, exhausting effort to stem the Allied tide. His entire defensive strategy relied on holding a continuous, unbreakable front line and massing his panzer divisions for a decisive, concentrated counterstroke. But the map told a deeply disturbing story. While the American advance at Omaha had been a bloody catastrophe, but was now largely contained, and the British advance at Sword and Gold was methodical and cautious, the Canadian sector in the center was a glaring, bleeding wound in the German lines. The 3rd Canadian Division had punched a deep, jagged salient toward Caen, threatening to outflank the entire defensive line and break out into the open tank country toward Falaise. Rommel summoned his frontline commanders. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and Kurt Meyer delivered their battlefield reports. The tone of the German officers, usually marked by a sneering, arrogant contempt for the fighting qualities of the Western Allies, was noticeably subdued. Meyer, a man who had survived the bloodbaths of Kharkov and Kursk, recounted the unbelievable stubbornness of the Canadian infantry. He reported that they did not panic under heavy artillery fire, that they fought with a desperate, improvisational savagery in the ruins of the villages, and that their anti-tank gunners possessed an almost suicidal bravery. The Hitler-Jugend Division, the absolute pride of the SS, was bleeding out into the Norman soil, suffering appalling, irreplaceable casualties simply trying to dislodge the Canadians from their hastily dug trenches. Rommel listened in grim silence, his sharp features illuminated by the harsh, buzzing glow of the Situation Room lamps. He possessed a grudging respect for his adversaries, a trait born in the sweeping deserts of North Africa. But he had never encountered this specific brand of relentless, unforgiving combat from Commonwealth troops. The British were masters of the set-piece battle, relying heavily on overwhelming artillery and devastating air support to pave their way. But these Canadians seemed entirely different. They were hyper-aggressive, tactically flexible, and alarmingly comfortable in the brutal, intimate violence of close-quarters combat. The Field Marshal realized that his grand counteroffensive, the sweeping, majestic maneuver designed to push the Allies back into the Channel, was dying in its infancy. It was dying not in a massive, glorious clash of armor on an open plain, but in 100 savage, isolated skirmishes amidst the claustrophobic, blood-soaked hedgerows of Auty, Buron, Puteaux, and Bletteville. The Canadians had violently seized the initiative on D-Day, and through sheer, bloody-minded attrition, they were refusing to give it back. Rommel turned back to the map, tapping a silver pencil against the red line bulging ominously south of Courseulles. The vital airfield at Carpiquet was still heavily contested. The strategic city of Caen, which was supposed to fall to the Allies on the very first day, remained firmly in German hands, but only because Rommel was forced to pour every available Panzer Division into the meat grinder just to hold it. The strategic reality was finally setting in. He was being pinned down, bled white by an enemy he had initially dismissed as secondary shock troops. As the pencil tapped against the map, Rommel's mind formulated a stark assessment of the men holding that salient. It was an assessment that would later be immortalized in his dispatches, a testament to the terrible crucible of those early days in Normandy. He knew now that the true threat to the German army in the West was not just the overwhelming industrial superiority of the Americans, nor the methodical, crushing planning of the British. The most immediate, lethal threat was the unrelenting fury of the shock troops holding the center of the line. The Desert Fox was finally beginning to understand exactly who had breached his Atlantic wall. July 4th, 1944, 0500 hours. The concrete bunkers of Carpiquet Airfield, 2 miles west of Caen. SS Schütze, Hans Kessler, presses his hands brutally hard over his ears, his jaw hanging open to equalize the crushing overpressure. The earth around him doesn't just shake, it liquefies. Chalk dust snows down from the reinforced ceiling of the Widerstands nest, coating the terrified, exhausted faces of the surviving Hitlerjugend defenders in a pale, ghostly shroud. Outside, the world is ending. A creeping barrage from 21 Canadian artillery regiments, backed by the earth-shattering 16-inch high-explosive shells of the battleship HMS Rodney anchored offshore, is methodically obliterating the airfield. Hangars are vaporized into twisted, blackened steel skeletons. Concrete tarmac shatters into lethal flying shrapnel. The sheer concussion makes noses bleed and lungs ache. Then, the rolling thunder of the guns lifts, shifting eastward to pound the next defensive line. Through the narrow, smoke-choked firing slit, Kessler sees them emerging from the pulverized ruins of the wheat fields, the infantry of the 3rd Canadian Division. Bayonets fixed, Lee Enfields leveled. They are not walking, they are sprinting. A month of unrelenting savage combat in the Norman bocage had forged the Canadians into a terrifyingly efficient instrument of war. The initial shock of the D-Day landings and the bitter, traumatizing ambushes of the first week were gone. The massacres of their comrades at the Ardenne Abbey had burned away any remaining illusions about the nature of this fight, replacing tactical doctrine with a cold, unrelenting vengeance. By the time Operation Windsor, the assault on the strategic Carpiquet Airfield, was launched in early July, the Canadian soldier had violently evolved. They had adapted to the fanatical German defensive tactics, mastering the grim, specialized art of combined arms infantry assault in confined, fortified spaces. Le Régiment de la Chaudière and the North Shore Regiment led the brutal frontal assault across the open runways. They were immediately met by a scythe of defensive fire from deeply entrenched Panther tanks of the 12th SS, dug in up to their turrets to act as invulnerable steel pillboxes. Green and red MG-42 tracers stitched the morning air, tearing through the Canadian ranks with terrifying speed. But the advance did not falter, and it did not break. Unlike the early days of June, the Canadians now fought with a calculated synergy that bordered on the mechanical. When an SS machine gun nest pinned down a platoon, they hit the dirt, laid down withering suppressive fire with Bren light machine guns, and called down their own artillery support. Canadian forward observation officers, moving right alongside the frontline troops through the mud and blood, radioed grid coordinates back to the artillery parks. Within minutes, a devastating time-on-target barrage would scream down from the sky, detonating directly over the German strongpoints. Then, before the dust and pulverized concrete could even settle, the infantry was in the trenches. They cleared the dugouts with fragmentation grenades and Thompson submachine guns. It was an industrialized, remorseless slaughter. The fighting around the hangars devolved into primal, close-quarters savagery. Flame-throwing Churchill crocodile tanks lumbered forward, spewing thick black arcs of jellied gasoline into the reinforced bunkers, burning out the fanatical defenders who steadfastly refused to surrender. By the end of the day, Carpiquet Airfield, a fortress the German high command had arrogantly believed could hold out for weeks, perhaps months, was a burning, smoking ruin entirely in Canadian hands. The 12th SS Panzer Division, once the pride of the Third Reich and the most feared armored unit in France, had been functionally destroyed. Its mighty tanks were burning, blackened wrecks. Its infantry battalions were reduced to hollow, traumatized fragments, incapable of mounting further offensives. 70 miles away, in the subterranean, chalk-carved map room at La Roche-Guyon, the atmosphere was suffocating. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat alone at his heavy oak desk, staring blankly at the staggering casualty reports. The flickering light of the wall sconces cast long, deep shadows across his exhausted, hollowed face. The Desert Fox, the legendary master of the armored counterstroke, was witnessing the slow, agonizing death of Army Group B. His chief of staff, General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, entered the room quietly, placing the latest intelligence intercepts on the desk. The news from every sector was catastrophic. The Americans were bleeding their way through the swamps of the Cotentin Peninsula. The British were methodically grinding down the defenses around the northern edges of Caen. But it was the center of the line, the sector held by the Canadian shock troops, that drew Rommel's intense, brooding focus. For weeks, Rommel had poured his absolute best reserves into the Meuse River Valley and the Caen sector to plug the bleeding gap the Canadians had created on D-Day. He had deployed the 12th SS, the elite Panzer Lehr Division, and the terrifying heavy Tiger tanks of the SS Panzer battalions. He had ordered them to execute sweeping maneuvers and hurl the invaders back into the English Channel. Instead, they had been fed into a merciless wood chipper. Rommel picked up his silver fountain pen. On his desk lay a half-written letter to his wife, Lucy. In the privacy of his personal correspondence, stripped of the bravado required for Hitler's sycophantic high command, Rommel was brutally honest about the reality on the ground. He had faced the British Eighth Army in the sprawling, open deserts of North Africa. He knew their tactics, their heavy reliance on logistical superiority, their cautious, methodical pacing. He had faced the Americans, whom he currently viewed as green but highly adaptable, backed by an overwhelming, terrifying industrial juggernaut. But the troops violently dismantling his best panzer units in Normandy were entirely different. They possessed the massive artillery backing of the British, but they fought with a visceral, unyielding ferocity that deeply shocked the hardened, arrogant veterans of the Eastern Front. Rommel began to write, his pen scratching sharply against the heavy parchment. He detailed the apocalyptic weight of the Allied naval guns and the swarms of Typhoon fighter bombers that made German movement by daylight entirely suicidal. But he reserved his most profound, sobering observation for the men physically taking the ground from his elite units. He realized that the German army was not just being outproduced, it was being decisively outfought in the very tactical, close-quarters environment where it was supposed to reign supreme. It was an admission of immense frustration, but also deep professional respect. Rommel recognized that the Canadian troops did not possess a predictable traditional approach to warfare. They were not fighting for glorious, sweeping cavalry charges. They were fighting a bitter, intimate war of extermination in the claustrophobic hedgerows. They pushed forward relentlessly, exploiting every micro-tactical gap, refusing to yield ground even when completely cut off and surrounded. When they were hit, they struck back with a disproportionate, staggering violence. They were, in the minds of the German generals facing them, the most formidable, lethal infantry in the entire Allied line. Rommel's final, chilling verdict on the enemy shattering his center echoed through the corridors of the German High Command. The British fought with strategy, the Americans fought with industry, but the Canadians fought like fiends. Rommel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. The realization was stark and unavoidable. The Atlantic Wall, his impenetrable fortress, had failed. The grand armored counterattacks had failed. The elite fanaticism of the SS had been met and permanently broken by the grim, quiet rage of men from Winnipeg, Halifax, and Quebec. The front was going to collapse. It was no longer a question of if, but when. The endgame for the Desert Fox was rapidly approaching, perfectly mirroring the imminent destruction of his forces in Normandy. The Canadians, having secured Carpiquet, would soon push into the shattered, bombed-out ruins of Caen, and eventually help close the deadly jaws of the Falaise Pocket, trapping the remnants of the German army in a slaughterhouse. But Rommel would not be there to see the final, crushing defeat. On July 17, 1944, just days after his grim realization regarding the Canadian onslaught, Rommel was traveling in his Horch staff car near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The skies, totally dominated by the Allies, were lethal. A patrolling fighter bomber, flown in a twist of poetic historical fate by Canadian pilot Charlie Fox of the Royal Canadian Air Force, spotted the lone German vehicle racing along the tree-lined road. Fox rolled his Supermarine Spitfire into a steep dive, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine screaming like a banshee. The 20mm Hispano cannons opened up, chewing through the asphalt and slamming directly into the staff car. The heavy Horch careened violently out of control, flipping end over end into a ditch. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, his skull fractured in 3 places. His campaign in Normandy abruptly and violently ended on the side of a dusty French road. He miraculously survived the crash, only to be forced into suicide by Hitler months later for his alleged role in the July 20th assassination plot. But as he was carried, bleeding and unconscious, from the asphalt, his war was over. The legacy of the Normandy campaign, however, was indelibly written in the blood, sweat, and chalk of the Bocage. The myth of German armored supremacy had been shattered. The Hitlerjugend had been ground to dust. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the preeminent tactical genius of the Third Reich, had been forced to acknowledge a terrifying truth. When the heavy gates of Fortress Europe were finally breached, it was the Canadians who kicked them in. And they fought like demons until the bitter end.